Thank you so much for joining us today, Marcela.
Thank you.
I saw Marcela speak at the Psychedelic Science Summit in Austin. It's kind of a tongue twister. And you shared so much of your story and so much about what was going on with the MAPS trials that I am very honored that you have come to share with the Plant Medicine podcast audience. So if you could talk a little bit about how you first got into MDMA assisted psychotherapy.
Okay, so MDMA got placed on Schedule 1 in 1985, meaning that there was no research, medical or research being able to be had with MDMA. And so before it was a Schedule 1, it was widely used among some therapists with really great results, really powerful, good results. And I was able to have treatment for PTSD with MDMA in 1984. I think I was 25 or 26 years old. And it really changed my life. It really gave me a new way of seeing what I needed to do in order to heal, and just really gave me possibilities. And it was so powerful that I, at that time, decided that I really wanted to advocate for this work and try to bring it to more people.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about what research had been done up to the point of when it became a Schedule 1 substance?
Yeah, so MDMA was synthesized in 1912, and but it was sort of shelved until the 70s because it wasn't. Yeah, it was just put on the shelf, and it was an intermediate compound for another substance. So then. The story is that Alexander Shulgin, the chemist, he had a student that brought it to his attention. So he resynthesized it and took it himself and realized that it had a lot of value, that it had the potential to build connection, openness. There was and able to really feel emotions but not get overwhelmed and not get flooded with them. So he gave it to his friend who was a psychologist, Leo Zeff, and he used it with his patients with really good results, and other therapists used it as well. Mostly it was used for couples therapy. With there's a lot of really good anecdotal evidence that it worked really, really well, and it was, it's said that approximately over 4,000 doses were done before that time. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, before it got placed on Schedule 1. So it was widely used, and even some psychiatrists testified when MDMA was getting scheduled to try to advocate for its value.
And what kinds of things were they finding? I'm assuming that whole, like you said, it decreases the fear response somewhat. So I'm assuming that the openness and the decreased fear is what was allowing couples to have more of a connection.
Yes, but it also places the inner critic and the judge aside. So you're able to come forth from this loving place, an open place of compassion, so that you can hear each other from this place that is not about attacking or judgment, that it's really like I am here listening truly to somebody giving me feedback, for instance. And so it's a way to really open up to receiving an experience and being able to receive it because you are open, and in some sense you are in this intimate connection with yourself, with who you truly are.
And outside of the couples therapy, I know you said you had done it for PTSD, and I know that most of the research has been done for PTSD. How does that kind of getting in touch with your inner self and leaving the inner critic behind help those with PTSD make more out of the therapeutic relationship than traditional psychotherapy?
Yeah, and that's something that it's very interesting because of course, there's a lot of hypotheses about the way the brain works, but what we know, what we hear and we know is that the amygdala, that really is a fear response, is what gets very active during a traumatic event. So the amygdala gets very activated, and your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus get deactivated. So the way that you process memory, that you process learning, that you regulate your emotions, all that gets very deactivated. And with MDMA, it's the opposite. So the amygdala gets deactivated so that that fear response is not so great that it overwhelms you. And your prefrontal lobe is activated and your hippocampus is activated, so you're able to really make connections and have insights and learning, and you have full access to your emotions. So it really, and then and it also, with trauma, there's an avoidance piece, right? There's an emotional numbing. MDMA does the opposite. It has access to memories. You're very, very present instead of just being stuck in a past. There's also lack of trust with trauma and hypervigilance, where an MDMA provides trust and bonding, and so it's almost like it just has the perfect combination of conditions to be able to really work on traumatic experiences in a safe way without being completely flooded by the memory and being traumatized again.
That makes total sense. I was reading that it impairs the fear response but increases oxytocin, which is that bonding hormone.
Yes.
And so that makes
Yes.
sense that
Also.
that it opens up a little bit the therapeutic alliance, I can imagine.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's just the serotonin, also the release of serotonin as a neurotransmitter, it just allows you to have a sense of well-being. So you have a sense of well-being, and oxytocin, a sense of bonding. Prolactin relaxes you, and so you're able to really use all that and be in a place where then you can access the trauma but still feel all those things. So they sort of are a resource, a container for you, a grounding place for you to be able to access these traumatic memories that are very difficult and painful.
That makes total sense. Oh, now, back in the day, you had tried it, experienced it, and then that inspired you to start working with it. So let's talk a little bit about, because you began working with MAPS, who we all know and love, and MAPS had the phase 2 trials recently that were so widely publicized for MDMA with PTSD. So if you could tell us a little bit about the findings of those studies and how they were undertaken.
Okay, so there were 6 phase 2 studies done. Boulder, so the study that I was a part of, we did one in Boulder, and we finished, I believe, in 2016 was when we finished the phase 2 trials. And the result was very, very positive, very promising. We had 67% of participants after 12 months after they finished treatment, no longer met criteria for PTSD. So that's with all the studies combined. In our Boulder study, we also, we just had such promising results that we had, 76% of people that were in our study, we treated 28 participants, no longer met criteria. 12 months later, this means we did a follow-up 2 months after they finished treatment and then 12 months after. And so it included 3 MDMA sessions for those who had let me back up a little bit. The phase 2 in Boulder we were trying to investigate dosage. So we had 3 doses and try to keep a blind going. And so we had 2 active doses, which were 100 milligrams and 125. and offered a supplemental dose of half of that an hour and a half later. And then we also had an active placebo, which was 40 milligrams with 20 milligrams offered as a supplemental dose. And it got unblinded after 2 treatments. So after 2 treatments, we unblinded and we found out those people who had the active placebo then had 3 MDMA sessions with full dose.
Oh, wow.
And,
So, okay. Okay, continue. Sorry.
yeah, and then the people who had full dose had 1 more. So everybody ended up with having 3 sessions with full dose MDMA.
Okay, and so the ones who had the active placebo, did they have to wait that 12-month period so that they could um, take the PTSD CAPS scale at the end of that 12 months before doing
No,
the 3? Okay, so they went straight into the other.
they would go straight into it. The minute it got unblinded, then they started their process of having their 3 open label. Like we knew open label meaning like we know what is being given.
Gotcha. And I know that there's a lot of psychotherapy that happens in between those as well. So everybody that got the active placebo also got the psychotherapy sessions that everybody else on the active
Yeah.
dose got. Correct. Okay.
Yes.
And if you could talk a little bit just about, I brought it up briefly, but what the CAP scale is, because sometimes we hear people throw around like they're investigating MDMA as a cure for PTSD, and there's not so much a cure. It's mostly, like you said, do they fit criteria? And so can you talk a little bit about how you measure that criteria?
Yes. So in phase 2, the criteria was treatment-resistant PTSD. So they had to have had at least 6 months of either therapy or medication or a combination of both, and that it just didn't maybe helped, but not helped enough, that they still met criteria for PTSD. In phase 3, we have it as severe PTSD. And so, wait, tell me your question again.
Oh, like how is their severity of PTSD after like you said, some of them no longer met criteria for having PTSD. How is that measured?
Oh, okay. So the CAPS is clinician administered PTSD scale. It's sort of like the gold standard for PTSD, and it measures severity. And in phase 2, we use the CAPS 4. In phase 3, we're using the CAPS 5. Now they have a new one, and it's the CAPS 5. So the numbers are a little bit different, but it measures their symptoms. And when we say 67% no longer met criteria, it meant that that cutoff for whatever is considered, the cutoff that is considered of having PTSD is no longer met. It doesn't mean that they don't have symptoms. It means that they don't have enough symptoms to have a diagnosis of PTSD. It doesn't affect them as much as it used to affect them in their life. Maybe they still have them. Maybe they even have days where they can get affected by it quite a bit. But it's not enough to meet that criteria to then be diagnosed as PTSD.
Okay, I understand. Now you said in the phase 2 trials, those who received the active dose had 67%. They no longer met that criteria at 12 months. What's the comparison? Was there a comparison? Because you said that everybody who had the active placebo ended up going through 3 full doses at some point. So was there a comparison group? Because I remember when we were at the conference, there was some graphic up that showed 67% versus maybe like a 25%. Who was in that 25%? What had they undergone?
Okay, so in some studies, they did have a full placebo. So in our Boulder study, we didn't. We had the active placebo. So then it's sort of like you could divide those 2 groups and say, what were the result of the people who had ended up with 5 sessions, 5 treatments, 2 of them with a lower dose and 3 of them with a fuller dose. So, so when I say in the Boulder study it was 76% no longer met criteria, I'm including everybody.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there were other studies where there were people who had received nothing except for the psychotherapy.
except for this. But they also went on to do full dose MDMA.
Right. And that was after the 12-month follow-up or after?
No,
No.
no,
Okay. So
no.
everybody ended up lovely. Okay. Everybody ended up getting the therapy. And how, like, is there a plan to follow them up at a certain number of years, or does the follow-up end at that 12-month?
It ends at the 12 months. We could consider, I think there has been considerations of maybe 3 years later, checking in with them and being able to give them the caps again and checking in with them and see how they're doing. I keep in touch with a lot of the people that went through phase 2, and there's a special bond that gets created when you're working with people and you're in this space where so much happens and there's a lot of vulnerability that takes place, and so there is a really sweet connection that happens.
Oh, I love that. I love that there's still that you still interact with them, and hopefully I do hope that there is that follow up, that we get to hear that yes, at 3 years out, many of them are still not meeting criteria. That would be
Yeah,
incredible.
yeah.
You mentioned before we started recording that there were also some open labels called MP16 and MP17. Those trials. Could you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so it's also a phase 2 study, and it involved, I think, 36 participants, and we had 11 sites in the US, 2 in Canada, 1 in Israel. And it was 2018, 2019, so it's pretty fresh, sort of that it's been done. And the way it was designed was as an open label, meaning that it didn't have a placebo arm. It was just, we knew we were giving MDMA. And they still had 3 treatments. And so every therapy pair that was of therapists, every therapy pair would treat 1 participant. And then they would have supervision on the whole study. So from beginning to end, because it was their first time that they were sitting with someone to do this work, and the first time that they were working together as a psychotherapy team. So in a way, kind of like a practice session, but not really, but it was live, right? They were working with a participant and getting a lot of support and supervision during it. The 3 sessions were, the first one was 80 milligrams, and then the other 2 were 120, and they could go back to the 80 if they wanted to, but they had 3 treatment sessions with therapy in between as well. So the same kind of a protocol, with very good results, which is amazing, because it's people who, therapists who we're just starting, right? Like doing this treatment. And one of the things that we want to know from phase 3 is, can this be duplicated? Can these good results be duplicated amongst many sites and different demographics? And so the answer so far is yes, it can.
Yeah, you were telling me a little bit about the improvement they were seeing in their CAP scale. I know that, like you said, it's still new and they haven't necessarily aggregated the data, but can you talk a little bit about what they've been finding so far?
Yeah, they found that the baseline caps for them was 45.7, and the end was 15.4. So it's a 66 drop. And so it's just like really, really good results. Really good results that we're having, and this is across so many different sites around the United States, and a couple in one in Europe and one in Canada.
Very cool. Very cool. Now, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on currently as MAPS is now moved into these phase 3 trials?
Yes. So now we have, in phase 3, we have 14 sites, and across the United States, we have 2 in Canada and 1 in Israel. We're treating, phase 3 is divided into 2 different studies, each one of them with 100 participants. So we're in what we call MAP 1, which is the first of those 100. and it's ongoing right now. We have one in Boulder that we're also doing a phase 3 site, and hopefully this will be. So this is the last phase before we can then ask FDA to move it through to move through the FDA process for it to become a medicine for PTSD.
Now, I saw that I believe it was after phase 2 that the FDA gave MDMA for PTSD, something called breakthrough therapy status. Is that correct on the timing?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. It was in 2017.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means for a drug to have breakthrough therapy status, and the fact that, as I understand it, it's never just like, okay, now MDMA has breakthrough therapy status for anything. They generally give it for whatever indication is being studied, correct?
Right, right. So it's a designation that sort of fast tracks it through the approval process. So they get more. It expedites the development and the review process of a drug, and it's given to a drug that is treating a serious or a life-threatening condition, which PTSD is, and it has preliminary results indicates that the drug could demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapies. So this is working better than some of the available therapists. So it has sort of like it's fast tracked right through the approval process, and hopefully. That will mean that we can really offer it, to other people. We also have a study, a protocol that is under review and in negotiations with the FDA for expanded access, which is compassionate use. Being able to use the drug while it's still before its approval. So still being able to use it because we want to provide it for people who are suffering with PTSD. Yeah,
that's incredible. And so that's underway, and at some point in time, the FDA will put down a ruling as to whether or not that is something that can be done.
Yeah, it's under negotiation in the moment.
Very, very cool. I love that. Okay, now I have a lot of medical professionals who listen to this show, and they many times come to me and they say, but aren't these substances addictive? And so I always love to have somebody in the science world explain a little bit about whether or not the substance is addictive and why or why not.
Mm-hmm. So, the potential for addiction is there with any kind of drug, right? But it has a low potential for abuse, for addiction and for dependency, that especially the way that we've seen it in the trials that we've had. So we've treated over 1,000 people, and in all the trials in phase 1, 2, and 3, and we have not seen the potential there for addiction, and we've given it 3 times, and that's it, right? And so it's not a drug that is going to be like a take-home drug or something that you can use on your own. It's more you do it in a therapeutic setting, and participants that have gone through our studies have felt like that maybe they have thought, oh yes, I do wish I had one more session, for instance, but it's not something that they're going to go out and do all the time or try to seek out. And and we have asked them those questions at the 12-month follow-up, and they have said no. So it doesn't seem to have it. If you do it in this controlled setting, it has low potential for abuse.
Okay, that's great to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Now, let's talk a little bit about whether you have found that there were any adverse effects or side effects in the MDMA therapy sessions.
We have some in the that are very temporary, that usually happen during a treatment session or for a day or two. So some of those are sometimes a little bit of nausea happens, a tightening of the jaw, a little bit. I'm trying to think of the ones that the most common ones that we have. So loss of appetite, some anxiety sometimes, a little bit of anxiety. Blood pressure and temperature are taken because your heart rate does increase, but it comes down on its own. So with some participants feel it, a lot of participants don't even actually feel that change. And it does come back to normal towards as the day goes by. So most of the symptoms that we have found, the adverse events, are short-lived.
That's great. Okay, good to know. Now, the last thing I would love to hear your thoughts on is we've been talking about MDMA for PTSD, but are there other areas that MDMA could be helpful for, other conditions?
Mm-hmm. So right now MAPS has done a few studies that haven't been for PTSD. So one of them is anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. That was a study that was done in Marin. Social anxiety with the autistic population, and what is it? A diet study that was done with cognitive behavioral conjunctive therapy. So there are other studies that are being done, and definitely more research is needed, and we want to do more research with other conditions that I think would be really helpful. I know in England also there was a study done with alcoholism. So more research is needed, and definitely more will be done. And PTSD is just a focus in the moment that we want to do in order to move it through the FDA process.
And once it's moved through the FDA process, will it be easier to study, or will that have no effect on the ease of maybe these other studies, like you said, being taken on for areas outside of PTSD?
I think it will be, like once you have, there's so much education that can be had, and once it gets the approval, going the regulation of MDMA, then going through this approval process that will take a while to go through the approval process as well. But then you can begin to work with other conditions. The other study that I was thinking of was that is being the protocol is already being written, and it's going to happen, is for eating disorders.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I think MDMA can help with a lot of different conditions.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think it would be easier once it gets approved for PTSD.
That's great to hear. If somebody has listened today and they're fascinated by this and they were interested in seeing if they would qualify for a study, where should they check out because you're still enrolling in the phase 3, correct?
Yes, we are still enrolling. So clinicaltrials.gov and also mdmaptsd.org. They will be able to find the information to apply for a study, and they can see where the studies are across the U.S.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining, for sharing your years of work and knowledge. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, for everybody else out there, until next time.